The midterm elections are now just weeks away, and any of these 5 scenarios could potentially significantly boost President Biden's re-election prospects in 2024, if he decides to run again for re-election, as he's indicated. The first is if Democrats end up holding the Senate. This scenario is possibly one of President Biden's likeliest scenarios to help him boost his re-election prospects against a potential primary challenger or against another Democrat who will come in and possibly take his place. Now, the president has said multiple times that he plans to run again for re-election in 2024, but there are a few scenarios where Democrats don't do as well as they thought they would in the midterms. The likelihood that President Biden faces a primary challenger actually gets more and more likely as the midterm season wraps up. So if Democrats hold the Senate, President Biden looks increasingly more likely to run again for re-election. That's because his party in power remains in a strong position. Now, most Democrats and Republicans alike think that the House is probably going to be a lost cause at this point, at least narrowly. But the Senate is where they have an opportunity to not only defend their turf, but to pick up some key battlegrounds, namely in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania, where 2 progressives are competing against pretty strong Trump-aligned Republican candidates. And if they do that, President Biden will be in a stronger position to not only make the case that his party is actually able to govern in the Senate, but that he's able to compete and win in some of these critical battlegrounds that he'll have to compete again in 2024 if he runs. The second scenario is if Republicans just narrowly win the House. Now, this is likely to happen among many Democrats and Republicans alike that I talk to, who say that just a couple of pickup opportunities for Republicans is enough to tip the scales in their favor. Now, how could this potentially help Biden in 2024? One Democrat I talked to recently put it this way: if Republicans do end up taking the lower chamber, they're already gunning to go all in full force on a lot of these investigations that they've been teeing up during President Biden's first term. That includes things like Hunter Biden, Anthony Fauci, going after major figureheads within the Democratic Party who are perceived as incredibly divisive, at least among the Trump faction of the GOP. Now, that could potentially help Biden's prospects in 2024 because it would give independents, namely, and even some moderate Republicans, something to contrast President Biden with against the GOP. Biden and a lot of Democrats thinking, including one who I talked to recently, said that the president will in turn end up looking more moderate, potentially more in line with where a lot of these independents and moderate Republicans stand, and the GOP will increasingly potentially look more fringe or closer aligned with President Trump. The third scenario is as we get closer to the midterms, investigations around former President Trump deepen. We've seen just recently, over the past couple of weeks, investigations into his financial and business dealings, some of his own family members, mainly his children, as well as other various investigations regarding his conduct in office, with the most recent raid of his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida, as indications that there's a major wild card around how this could potentially impact President Biden if he seeks re-election again. Some Democrats believe that if Trump is taken out of the equation through ways of an indictment or some similar judicial prosecution, that he would be completely removed from the 2024 chatter, leaving open the space for Biden to run against an unknown Republican. And so somebody like Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, or other figures in the Republican Party are much less known than the sitting president. That being said, Biden is currently leading Trump in most polls, and so there is an inherent advantage, at least polling-wise at this point, to having Biden run against the former president. But as the investigations balloon and take on different forms seemingly every day in the news cycle as we inch towards the midterms, the camp that believes that if Trump is not in the equation at all will only benefit Biden seems to be growing louder and louder in terms of the public opinion. The fourth scenario that's benefiting President Biden in 2024 is if the Republicans' so-called culture wars end up backfiring on them. This is a tricky one because we've seen the strategy of leaning in heavily on these so-called cultural issues, very divisive topics, actually worked well for the Republicans in 2021, namely in the Virginia gubernatorial election and also in New Jersey. And so Republicans are really trying to run the playbook of crime, of immigration, and leaning into the Trump-era policies that really ignited his base when he was in charge. But Democrats are hoping that that gamble will backfire on them and that voters will reject the notion that this country is more interested in battling on the cultural issues than, say, things like the economy or jobs or things that are typically fought, won, and lost in election cycles. Most recently, we saw this happen where Ron DeSantis, who I mentioned, the Florida governor, Republican, took quite a drastic stance to send some of the migrants who are residing in Florida in his home state to the so-called sanctuary city of Martha's Vineyard, in a move that really shocked definitely independents and Democrats, but even some Republicans within his own party who said, look, this is tantamount to something like human trafficking. It's being, battled with legal questions of if this was something that he was actually able to do, and future governors of red states. And so Democrats are leaning in heavily to that issue, as well as the issue of abortion. We saw the Supreme Court conservative majority overturn Roe versus Wade, which the Republicans are hoping works in their favor, but even some are privately acknowledging that it's not so cut and dry, that they actually may have a harder climb to really move some of those voters onto their side of sometimes near total abortion bans in a lot of these states. And so Democrats are hoping that a combination of immigration, crime, you've seen Democrats embrace a more friendly stance towards police in order to combat some of those culture wars from the other side. They're hoping that those issues are able to really capture a base that is more moderate, more in line with, again, what public polling says, and make the GOP kind of backfire on itself. The fifth and certainly least likely scenario that could potentially help President Biden in 2024 is if Democrats end up holding everything, that is, the House and the Senate. Now, this is incredibly unlikely to happen, and many Democrats are skeptical to even think of this possibility or talk about it out loud because it seems so unlikely. There are many estimates that put the margin of error extremely thin in the House of Representatives. It's, like I said, it's likely to be lost in the midterms. If the Senate is held on, then that's another story. It could potentially benefit the president, but the likelihood that the party in power holds both is extremely slim. And if that does end up happening, if Democrats are able to maintain their slim, razor-thin majority, particularly in the House, but also in the Senate, then President Biden would certainly run on a record of accomplishment, on something that bucks historical precedent. We see cycle after cycle the party in power loses the House. Time and time again, it's not necessarily cut down ideological lines, it happens within both parties. And so if he managed to kind of pull a rabbit out of the hat and keep both houses of Congress, then he would be able to run effectively as creating something of a political miracle in a climate that really had been working against him.